Russia's new leadership has intensified hostilities in Chechnya. Moscow claims to have made inroads against rebel positions in the south, and it's accusing Chechen fighters of using poison gas. Our Moscow correspondent Andrew Harding reports.
Russian soldiers shout out Happy New Year as they send another shell hurtling into Grozny. It's a new millennium, but the same old savage war in Chechnya. There's not much to celebrate here. These young Russian conscripts are taking heavy losses as they try to seize the Chechen capital. Russian guns are pounding the city with growing ferocity and frustration. The Chechen rebels are heavily outnumbered, but they're well armed and well dug in, and they seem to be holding their ground. Today, Russian troops scrambled to put on masks as Moscow accused the Chechen rebels of releasing a cloud of toxic gas. This war is becoming uglier by the day. Both sides are losing men, but it's the civilian population which continues to suffer the most. This family is burying an 11-year-old girl killed by a Russian bomb. International appeals for a ceasefire are still falling on deaf ears. Boris Yeltsin may no longer be in power here, but that won't affect Russia's military campaign. If anything, the new acting president, Vladimir Putin, will take an even tougher line than before. Tens of thousands of civilians trapped in the war zone are facing a bleak new year. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Moscow.
The Russian embassy in the Lebanese capital Beirut has been attacked with rocket-propelled grenades. 2 people have been killed, 1 policeman and 1 man the security forces say carried out the attack. It's thought he may have been protesting about the Russian campaign in Chechnya.
It was reminiscent of the old days in Beirut. The gunfire that the people of this city had thought they'd heard the last of some years ago. This, though, had been prompted by an attack on the Russian embassy, and within minutes, members of the Lebanese security forces were returning fire in ferocious fashion. There was considerable chaos as the police and army tried to clear the streets. They took up positions close to a high-rise building where a gunman armed with rocket-propelled grenades was holed up. There was uncertainty about whether the attacker was acting alone, but the situation appears to have been resolved after the security forces stormed the building and brought out the body of a man who was said to have been a Palestinian. There are reports that he'd been carrying a note saying he'd sacrificed himself for the Chechen cause in the war against the Russians. 1 policeman was killed and at least half a dozen wounded in this shootout. It may have been an isolated incident, but not for the first time, it seems. The conflict in Chechnya has spilled over into the Middle East. Peter Biles, BBC News.
Russia says its forces are continuing to meet fierce resistance from rebel fighters defending the Chechen capital Grozny. The rebels, who want to break away from the Russian Federation, say they remain in control of most of the city. The war in Chechnya has made Russia's new acting President Vladimir Putin very popular, but Kremlin officials admit that any setbacks there could damage his chances of winning the presidential elections in March. Our special correspondent Ben Brown reports.
A boy looks up into the skies over Grozny and wonders where the next bomb, the next shell is coming from. No one walks in this city anymore, everybody runs. Just by being above ground here, you dice with death. The civilians still trapped in Grozny are hiding out in bomb shelters. There are thought to be up to 40,000 of them. This is where they live day and night, only occasionally daring to go out to forage for food and water. The Chechen rebels insist they're still in control of their capital, despite an all-out Russian offensive that began on Christmas Day. The rebels say they won't abandon the city. In parts of it at least, they can still move around freely, but Grozny looks like it's just been through World War II, and gradually it's being wiped off the map. There may be only a couple of thousand rebels left here, but for now they're holding back the might of the entire Russian army. Their weapons are improvised, they're outmanned and outgunned, but these Islamic rebels believe God is on their side. The Russian onslaught on Grozny has stalled. And that's dangerous for the man who's masterminded it, Vladimir Putin, Russia's acting president, who took over from Boris Yeltsin on New Year's Eve. The voters seem certain to give Mr. Putin the job full-time, but a senior Kremlin official told me Chechnya could yet change that.
He's not finding a war to win an election. That's evident. But at the same time, I mean, anyone and any political analyst can tell you that, of course, if something goes wrong there, it could influence his results in the presidential election. That's only natural.
Thanks to the war, Vladimir Putin's poll ratings are sky high. He'd like the election to be held tomorrow. In fact, he'll have to wait 3 months. Plenty of time for setbacks in Chechnya, plenty of time for his popularity to plummet. Mr. Putin must be feeling nervous. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
The Russian army has increased security in Chechnya amid fears of further counterattacks by Chechen rebels. At the weekend, troops temporarily lost control of several strategic areas close to the capital, Grozny. Andrew Harding has been to Argun to find out who's now in control of the town.
This is central Chechnya, or at least what's left of it. We were taken into the war zone by Russian troops, keen to show us they are back in control here. But the soldiers were edgy. The town of Argun has only just been recaptured after a furious battle. More reinforcements were pouring in. There are fears the Chechen rebels, now hiding in the countryside, could strike again. The civilian population can do little but watch and hope. These people are trapped between two armies. Inevitably, many are getting caught in the crossfire. Ina was hit by shrapnel 3 days ago. She lost her left leg and her unborn child. The local hospital has no electricity and little medicine. I don't know what the Russians are promising, said the doctor, but they haven't helped us yet. The Russians say they will bring peace and security to towns like Argun. But when? Soon, said the local commander, promising to hunt down every last rebel. But Russia has confidently predicted victory many times before. The Chechen rebels cannot be written off so easily. What happened here in Argun will certainly happen elsewhere in Chechnya. The rebels have sworn to fight a partisan war. There's little, it seems, the Russians can do to stop them. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Argun, Chechnya.
Human rights officials have pressed for a ceasefire in Chechnya. They held a meeting today in Moscow with the Russian acting president Vladimir Putin. In Chechnya, the fighting is getting worse as Russian troops tighten their grip on the capital Grozny. The Russian government says it expects to be in full control of that city by early next month. This report was sent by our correspondent Robert Parsons.
Russia says it's got Chechnya's rebel fighters in its sights. The war, it claims, is coming to a climax and only Russia can win. But on the ground, the soldiers don't seem so sure. They're having to fight for every crumbling building and every muddy street. Progress is painfully slow. Losses are high. Territory no sooner gained is lost again. The generals say they're handicapped by the continuing presence of thousands of civilians in Grozny's ruins. Occasionally they make a run for it, braving the snipers' alleys that crisscross the city. It's a trickle, but still they come. A pitiful trail of humanity, traumatized by one of the most savage bombardments of a city since the Second World War. There are few comforts left in lives like these, but what little they have, they cling to. Aisha and her grandfather spent the last 3 weeks cold and hungry, sheltering in cellars from the shrapnel and bullets. Aisha is 8 months pregnant and has had to leave her children behind. Many of the civilians still hiding in Grozny are ethnic Russians, but the military says it's stepping up the offensive. Grozny could be ground to dust. Here at Russian military headquarters, the generals say the Chechen campaign is back on the rails. The rebels are being crushed and Russian losses are small. But the apparent confidence has yet to be matched by deeds. The rebels still hold Grozny and show no signs of backing down. Robert Parsons, BBC News, with the Russian forces in the North Caucasus.
Russian military leaders say they've made a crucial advance into the center of the Chechen capital Grozny. Chechen commanders have confirmed that there's been heavy fighting in the city. Our correspondent Robert Parsons reports from Russian military headquarters in North Ossetia, which neighbors Chechnya.
Grozny is engulfed in a storm of fire. Russia has launched its heaviest offensive on the Chechen capital yet. The Russian forces struck simultaneously from several directions, stretching the rebel defenses and exploiting their own massive advantage in manpower. Armoured forces are reported to have broken through gaps in the Chechen lines. And the Russians have complete domination of the air. Wherever the infantry meets resistance, fighter bombers move in, pulverizing concentrations of rebel forces. A constant pall of smoke hangs over the city, blotting out the sky. District by district, street by street, Grozny is being reduced to blackened ruins. The further the Russians move in, the tougher it becomes. They're meeting ferocious opposition all over the city. Casualties are high. The soldiers advance with caution, wary of mines and booby traps, but most of all, Chechen bullets. The city has become a sniper's paradise, a wasteland of rubble and hollowed-out buildings that makes them almost impossible to see. But the rebel fighters are being squeezed. Their resistance looks increasingly desperate, and they know that if they cling on too long, they risk being trapped and destroyed. 1 month after the Russians launched their assault on Grozny, the Chechen capital seems almost within their grasp. Here at Russian military headquarters, there's a mood of quiet confidence again. Rightly or wrongly, they sense that the worst is past, that they've wrestled back the military initiative. The war, they believe, is entering a decisive and victorious phase. Robert Parsons, BBC News, with the Russian forces in the North Caucasus.
There's been fierce fighting on the streets of Chechnya's capital, Grozny, as the Russians battle to take control of the ruined city. Thousands of civilians are still in hiding there, trapped by sniper fire and shelling. Across the Republic, the Chechen people say they're in urgent need of medical and other supplies. Andrew Harding has travelled into Chechnya and sent this report.
Grozny is being ground to dust. Russian artillery pounds the city round the clock, more savagely now than ever before. Somewhere amidst the flames and the rubble, Russian and Chechen troops are fighting and dying for every inch of territory. For a month now, the two sides have been struggling for control of the city. The Russians say they're now making steady progress. The Chechens insist they're holding their ground. Access to the war zone is tightly restricted, but today we managed to get into Chechnya with a delegation of Russian government officials. They'd come to a town outside Grozny to discuss the daunting task of rebuilding areas now under Russian control. The officials promised to bring money and medicine to help tens of thousands of cold, desperate civilians. We're here to look after you, said the Kremlin's envoy, but few in the crowd seemed to believe him. Instead, they accused the Russian military of indiscriminate brutality. Many of these people are refugees who've come down from the southern mountains where they say the Russian Air Force is bombing their villages every day. New victims are being brought in all the time. This woman was carrying her baby when a rocket exploded nearby. She lost her arm, but the child survived. As we left town, the Russian guns were starting up again, aiming towards rebel bases in the mountains. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Chechnya.
Russian forces in Chechnya have taken control of the largest village in the rebel stronghold in the southern mountains. Fierce fighting is continuing in the capital Grozny as Russian forces advance towards the center. But as our correspondent Andrew Harding reports, they've again met stiff resistance from Chechen fighters.
The battle for Grozny rages on. Russian troops inch forwards under fire from Chechen snipers. For a month now, the two sides have fought for control of these streets, a nuclear superpower against a small band of guerrillas. Against the odds, the Chechen rebels are still clinging on to what's left of the city centre. Outside Grozny, Russian forces are making better progress. Today they announced they'd finally seized control of Vedino, a rebel stronghold in the mountains. The Russians are hoping to cut their supply lines and escape routes. Elsewhere in the Republic, Russian troops remain on high alert. These soldiers are guarding another important town, Urus-Martan. It's quiet here at the moment, but no one knows how long that will last. The locals don't want the rebels back, but few people seem to trust the Russians either. I wish they'd all just leave us in peace, said this man. Our republic has suffered enough. But there can be no stability here until Russian forces have captured Grozny, and perhaps not even then. The Russians are promising victory and peace in Chechnya within the next couple of months, but they may need to keep tens of thousands of troops stationed here for years to come if they're to keep the rebels at bay. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Chechnya.
Russia says the body of one of its generals, missing for several days, has been found in the Chechen capital Grozny. Fierce fighting has continued in the center, but in a sign of increasing confidence, the Russian flag has been hoisted in one part of the city. Our correspondent Andrew Harding reports from the besieged capital.
Russian soldiers fire across the street at the Chechen rebels. The battle for Grozny is being fought at close range, house to house, cellar to cellar. The rebels are more experienced, but the Russians have more men and more weapons, and it's beginning to show. Slowly, painfully slowly, Moscow's forces are gaining the upper hand. The Kremlin claimed it had finally seized control of a third of Grozny. To mark the occasion, a Russian flag was handed to a group of local Chechen volunteers who've been fighting on the Russian side against the rebels. All this is good propaganda for the Kremlin, but the truth is that Russian forces only control a few of Grozny's suburbs. It's not much to show for a month of ferocious street fighting and countless dead. But the Russians don't see it like that. They are steadily turning the entire republic into a fortress, garrisoning every town, every village, every hilltop. Like some lumbering giant, Russia's military offensive grinds on, slow, savage, but perhaps unstoppable. Russia has the determination to win this war at any cost. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Chechnya.
Russian troops are still trying to take full control of the Chechen capital Grozny. The bombing goes on and the desperate plight of the refugees gets worse. An estimated 250,000 are now in neighbouring Ingushetia. Conditions are deteriorating. This report from the region is by our correspondent Bridget Kendall.
This is the way the Russians go to war in Chechnya. A ramshackle convoy we met on its way through the main border post to Grozny. Teenage conscripts, barely able to drive, let alone fight. Unofficial military sources say Russian losses are mounting. When soldiers have to be towed to the front line, it's hardly surprising. And this is what's going on in Grozny. 7 days since this decisive attack started, Russian rocket launchers are still pounding the city. They've successfully taken one district, but all this firepower has failed to dislodge Chechen rebels in the center. What's left is utter devastation. In a camp across the border in Ingushetia, new refugees bring harrowing tales. 80% of Grozny is ruined, say those who just arrived, far worse than in the last war, with many more civilian casualties.
It's not Chechen fighters they're hitting, it's us, local residents. The Russians return fire, but by then the Chechen snipers have long gone, and we civilians are the ones they're shelling.
And now the bitter cold has brought a flu epidemic and an outbreak of tuberculosis. With no proper medicines, a few medics here say it's a catastrophe. Grozny is only 40 kilometers away, and you can often hear the bombardments in the distance. No wonder the doctors here say that everyone is either sick or traumatized. Of course, they all want the war to end, but as far as the outside world is concerned, they've long given up any hope of any help from that quarter. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, in Ingushetia, near the Chechen border.
9,000 refugees have left Chechnya in just 4 days as the Russians continue their fierce bombardment. The Russians admit that 1,200 of their soldiers at least have been killed in the fighting. Conditions in some of the refugee camps in Ingushetia, the neighbouring state, are appalling. Our correspondent Bridget Kendall reports now from one camp northeast of Nazran.
Through the snowy forests outside Grozny, the Russian soldiers search for Chechen snipers. 4 times in the last 24 hours, the Russians say they've failed to take the city centre. And here too, on the edge of town, they have to watch their back for small, mobile units of Chechens looking for a chance to ambush. Both sides now admit heavy casualties, and for the first time, official figures put the number of dead Russian troops in this war at over 1,000. Today, their highest-ranking loss so far was given due honours. General Malafeyev fell while leading troops into battle in Grozny last week. The Chechens had claimed they'd kidnapped him. But today the Russians showed his open coffin, proving they may have lost a general, but at least he's not a Chechen hostage. Across the border in Ingushetia, civilian victims of this war lead a life of misery. In this abandoned cowshed, we found 1,000 refugees, 15 to a pen, crammed in with their animals. They get almost no outside help. Yesterday, Thaisa sold her last gold chain to buy her children cough medicine. Meanwhile, thousands of frightened new arrivals find the refugee camps have nowhere to put them.
The Russians promised us we'd be looked after here, fed 3 times a day, but there's no help, absolutely nothing.
And Moscow's solution, says the commandant, is to order refugees back to Russian-controlled Chechnya by threatening to cut off food and shelter. The worst thing about the heart-rending tales of those who just escaped from Grozny is what they find when they get here. They've lost everything, they've been through the horror of being bombed, and now it's as though nobody wants or is able to help them. Bridget Kendall.
Heavy snow is slowing down the Russian efforts to take full control of the Chechen capital Grozny. The weather is also making things even more difficult for the refugees. There's serious overcrowding in the refugee camps. At least 500 people have nowhere to stay. At the camps in neighbouring Ingushetia, the United Nations is warning that flu and TB are now spreading. From there, Bridget Kendall now reports.
Despite the rough weather, the attack on Grozny has not subsided. Russian artillery pounded the city. Once again, Moscow rejected talks with the Chechen president. From his secret mountain retreat, President Maskhadov released this rare videotaped interview.
Russia is still waving around its nuclear weapons. To make Russia obey international laws, strong economic sanctions must be applied.
As for civilians, this is what awaits refugees who fled Chechnya after months of hiding from bombs in cellars. A cluster of tents in a snowy courtyard in Ingushetia, home to several hundred families. Rosa's grandmother has flu. The family fled 2 weeks ago from a Grozny suburb. They sleep on damp blankets and bare boards of a communal bunk they built themselves. Melted snow seeps through the canvas. It's completely wet. There's a stove to heat the tent, but they run out of money to buy wood for it. The local doctor is himself a refugee from Grozny. He showed me 2 old men whose flu has turned to pneumonia. He says one may not live much longer.
Aspirin?
Aspirin. So 50 sets of aspirin. And these are the only medicines the doctor has left, essentially a handful of painkillers. So, Valeria, what do you need most of all as a doctor here?
Больше всего мы нуждаемся в антибиотиках.
Antibiotics, he said, to stop secondary infections. The UNHCR concedes it's not done enough. On a brief visit here today, their regional representative admitted they're hampered by the fear of being kidnapped.
We have had tragedies in the past. My predecessor himself was kidnapped and held for a year.
The UNHCR admit they face an enormous task here, with over 260 places like this where refugees are scattered across Ingushetia. And as the winter sets in, their plight can only get worse. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
The latest effort to stop the war in Chechnya comes from the United Nations boss Kofi Annan. But as the Secretary-General started a series of meetings in Moscow, the Russian troops were still bombing and shooting their way into the Chechen capital, making far more people homeless. More now from our correspondent, Peter Biles.
There's no end in sight to the misery of the refugees on the Chechen border. Young and old alike make the best of what they've got. It isn't much. The UN wants urgent action to ease their suffering. The UN Secretary-General is in Moscow pressing for an end to the war, and he says the interests of civilians must be paramount.
Whilst we all support attempts to root out terrorists, we should take every step to protect the rights of the civilians and ensure that they do not suffer undue hardship.
This is now the worst of the winter, and the Russians are pressing on, determined to crush the Chechen rebels and capture Grozny. Russian soldiers pound the Chechen positions in the southern mountains in a desperate attempt to cut the rebels' supply routes. Moscow says confidently that a major breakthrough is looming in the battle for Grozny, but such predictions have been made before, and still the war continues. At the Council of Europe in Strasbourg today, Russia's foreign minister again sought to justify the military campaign. Igor Ivanov said Russia was defending Europe's common border against the onslaught of international terrorism. In further talks here tomorrow, Kofi Annan will have his work cut out, trying to convince Russian leaders to end the war in Chechnya. Russia still believes fervently that its military actions are justified, whatever the consequences may be for Chechnya's civilian population. Peter Biles, BBC News, Moscow.
It's been another day of fierce fighting in Chechnya, with the rebels still stopping the Russians from taking full control of the capital Grozny. The Russian authorities, anxious to show that their campaign is a success, took a group of journalists to the front line, and our correspondent Bridget Kendall was with them.
When the going gets rough, what soldiers need is spiritual sustenance. So, a group of Moscow writers and musicians arrived here today to cheer up the troops and see for themselves life on the front line southeast of Grozny. These soldiers have been in position for a month, camped out in the mud and snow. The front line is over there, the local commander tells the writers. The aim is to tighten the noose around Grozny and stop food or weapons getting to it. This is occupied Russian territory, and the aim of these artillery positions is to cut off supplies to the rebels in Grozny from their hideouts in the mountains. But even that is precarious, say the soldiers here, when the villages around are full of hostile Chechens. In the nearest Grozny suburb, street-by-street fighting continues. The Russians are always on their guard. Chechen fighters pulled out of these streets a few days ago. "Welcome to hell," says the graffiti at one of their abandoned bunkers. "We're in charge of this place now," this Russian soldier tells a local resident who's braved the bombardment. But Chechens still control the city's underground passages and can ambush at any time. Back in the Russian trenches, there's an impromptu concert. The soldiers obediently line up to listen to their Moscow guests. A bizarre tableau, a tender Russian folk song in the midst of a messy battle for the future of Chechnya. And as night falls, the soldiers here seem resigned for a long haul. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, with the Russian forces in eastern Chechnya.